On April 10, 1989, Jeffrey Don Lundgren, a self-proclaimed prophet, gave chilling instructions to two of his followers: dig a pit in the barn. Not just any pit, one deep enough to hold 5 bodies. Just a week later, on April 17, he invited the Avery family, Dennis, Cheryl, Trina, Rebecca and little Karen, and his followers on what he called a wilderness trip. But this was no ordinary trip. That night, Lundgren gathered his men in a motel room, questioning them about their commitment to what he called the sacrifice. Only those who swore loyalty were included. Dennis Avery, unaware, was later lured into the barn by Lundgren and an accomplice under the pretense of helping with camping equipment. What followed was horrifying. In a carefully orchestrated plan, Avery and his family were killed in cold blood, one by one, while the rest of the world remained unaware. Lundgren's ability to manipulate, deceive and command loyalty turned faith into a weapon, and a trusting family into victims. Their names, their lives, vanished under the guise of obedience to a man who claimed to speak for God. Before the end, Jeffrey was asked one final question: "What do you want for your last meal?" To understand the full scope of this jaw-dropping story, let's rewind to where it all started. Make sure you subscribe so you won't miss our next episode. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was born on May 3, 1950, in Independence, Missouri, into a childhood marked by turbulence and isolation. Raised in the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now known as the Community of Christ, he was steeped in religious teachings from an early age, yet his home life was far from nurturing. According to both Lundgren and former neighbors, he endured severe abuse, particularly at the hands of his father, leaving deep scars that would shape his personality and worldview. As a boy, he was naturally quiet, intensely focused and increasingly withdrawn. A loner in middle and high school who found solace in the woods, learning to hunt and handle firearms under his father's guidance. These skills, once innocent, would later become part of the dark practicality he would wield in his adult life. In his late teens, Lundgren sought purpose beyond his isolated existence, enrolling at Central Missouri State University and spending time at a house specially built for our LDS youth. There he met Alice Keeler, who shared a history of childhood abuse, and the two quickly bonded, marrying in 1970 and starting a family. Their first son was born the same year, followed by additional children in 1974, 1979 and 1980, as Lundgren tried to balance the responsibilities of fatherhood with his restless ambitions. In 1974 he enlisted in the United States Navy, seeking direction and stability, but his early discharge, granted reluctantly, hinted at a man frustrated by authority yet convinced of his own importance. Life after the Navy was no easier. Economic strain and personal tension clouded the household, and those close to the family reported that Lundgren's frustration and controlling nature sometimes escalated to abuse, including a serious incident that sent his wife to the hospital. After years of devotion to his church, Jeffrey Lundgren appeared to have found a place in the world through his role as a lay minister and as a guide at the historic Kirtland Temple, a position that gave him both prestige and a sense of purpose within the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. To outsiders, he was a man of faith, respected for his knowledge of Scripture and his ability to inspire those around him, but beneath the surface, the quiet, intense loner from Missouri was beginning to grow restless, frustrated by the limitations imposed on him and resentful of the very church leadership he had once served with loyalty, feeling that their suspicion and scrutiny were unjust and that his potential for spiritual insight was being stifled. This simmering bitterness reached a boiling point in 1987, when the church dismissed him as a lay minister, citing concerns that he had misappropriated donations, an accusation he denied, yet one that deeply wounded his ego and fueled a sense of persecution and divine mission. Instead of retreating, Lundgren began to reinterpret Scripture on his own terms, claiming that he had received special revelations from God, visions and insights that only he could understand and teach, positioning himself as a messenger who transcended the authority of the very church that had cast him aside. As his words spread among a small circle of followers, the dynamic shifted. What had once been mutual faith became one-sided devotion, with Lundgren moving from preacher to controller, from spiritual guide to unquestioned authority, and those who joined him no longer saw him simply as a teacher. They began calling him Dad, a title that blurred the lines between religious leadership and familial power, cementing his influence over their minds, their loyalty and eventually their actions. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Lundgren had transformed from a dismissed minister into something far more dangerous. A man building his own world, a world where he was not just a leader but the center of everything. That world took shape on a remote farm in Kirtland, Ohio, hidden away from neighbors, from authorities, from anyone who might see what was really happening inside. On the surface, the farm looked peaceful, a place for prayer, study, and reflection. But inside, it was a place where every aspect of life was carefully controlled. Every meal, every chore, every routine reinforced Lundgren's presence, reminding his followers that their lives, their choices, even their understanding of right and wrong, revolved entirely around him. Isolation was his most powerful tool. Cut off from friends, family, and the outside world, the followers had no perspective other than what he provided. Slowly, quietly, he convinced them that he was not just a man, but a vessel of divine truth. Their reality shrank to the boundaries of the farm, and in that shrinking world, obedience felt like faith. Doubts that might have seemed natural elsewhere were twisted into spiritual failings, guilt-laden and suffocating. Every small act of submission became a test, every minor task a measure of loyalty, and gradually independent thought began to vanish. Lundgren also wielded financial control with precision. Followers were expected to give money, possessions, and labor to support the farm and the group, and refusal was framed as evidence of weak faith. Each contribution deepened their dependence, tying their survival and sense of purpose to his approval. It wasn't just control, it was a slow, psychological shaping of minds, hearts, and souls, convincing people that living for him was living for God. The psychological manipulation didn't stop there. He used spiritual discipline to mask coercion, turning obedience into a moral imperative. Missteps, hesitations, or even questions were treated as signs of spiritual weakness, prompting public confessions or demonstrations of loyalty. Tasks that started as simple chores escalated into acts that demanded unquestioning submission. Each day on the farm, followers were being trained, molded, conditioned to respond without thought, to equate obedience with faith and devotion with survival. Life on the farm became a slow, relentless pressure cooker. The followers worked, ate, and slept under his gaze. They learned that questioning him was questioning God, and that failing him could mean spiritual, and eventually physical, consequences. The farm, outwardly a sanctuary, was becoming a crucible of control, shaping ordinary people into a community entirely dependent on one man's authority. And through it all, one question lingered like a shadow over everyone within his world. At what point does devotion end and blind obedience begin, and how far will people go when they truly believe God himself is commanding it? I need you to answer this question in the comments section. Meanwhile, 7 of Lundgren's 12 followers had already moved into his family's farmhouse, fully under his influence and obedience, leaving the remaining 5, the Avery family, to maintain a separate place within the community. Dennis Avery had sold his house in Missouri and uprooted his family, trusting Lundgren completely, believing that their move to Ohio would bring them closer to God and integrate them into a devout, spiritual community. Alongside him were his wife Cheryl and their 3 daughters, Trina, 15, Becky, 13, and little Karen, 6, children who had no reason to doubt the man they thought was a spiritual guide. Their trust was absolute, their faith genuine, and their devotion made them invisible to the growing storm of Lundgren's paranoia. Yet Lundgren saw them differently. He considered Dennis weak, a liability to the sect he was building, and began speaking against him behind his back, framing Avery as the cause of the group's problems even though he was one of the largest financial contributors. When Dennis set aside a modest sum of money for his family's personal use, Lundgren twisted the act into a sin, insisting that total obedience required giving everything exclusively to him. Slowly, the seeds of resentment, manipulation, and control began to take root, isolating the Averys not just physically but emotionally and spiritually, as they remained blind to the danger closing in around them. Lundgren's paranoia escalated, and he began preparing his followers for increasingly extreme acts. At first, he suggested seizing the temple from which he had already stolen about $40,000, and killing anyone who stood in their way. But even this plan evolved. In his warped vision, only the Avery family had to be punished for their perceived disloyalty. In his mind, their failure justified the unimaginable, and he chillingly described the act as pruning the vineyard, turning murder into a supposed divine cleansing. The Averys remained devoted, trusting, and unsuspecting, believing they were serving God and their community, while Lundgren's control over his followers and over the narrative of faith had grown absolute. Loyalty, obedience, and the promise of spiritual reward had replaced morality, reason, and compassion. Dennis, Cheryl, Trina, Becky, and Karen were now caught in the trajectory of a man whose mind had become a dangerous labyrinth of delusion, manipulation, and deadly authority, setting the stage for the horror that was about to unfold. By the time April 17, 1989 arrived, The outcome had already been decided. A full week earlier, on April 10, Jeffrey Lundgren quietly set the final stage by instructing 2 loyal followers to dig a deep pit inside the barn. It wasn't framed as something sinister, it was spoken of with purpose, almost reverence, but the size of the pit told the truth. Lundgren made it clear it needed to be large enough for 5 bodies. Still, to the rest of the group, including the Avery family, he continued to speak calmly about a coming wilderness trip, a spiritual journey that would supposedly bring them closer to God. No one was told that this trip would never happen. That evening, Lundgren gathered all 12 followers for dinner at a rented motel room. The mood was ordinary, almost disarmingly normal. Food on the table, casual conversation, the illusion of community still intact. After dinner, Lundgren asked only the men to join him privately. One by one, he questioned them about their loyalty and their willingness to obey without hesitation. He framed what was coming as a test of faith, a sacrifice required to move forward spiritually. Each man assured him they were committed. Dennis Avery was intentionally left out of this meeting, excluded from the decision that would cost him and his family their lives. Later that night, under the guise of preparation, Dennis was asked to help with equipment for the supposed trip. Trusting the people around him, he followed without resistance. Inside the barn, Lundgren waited, armed with a .45 caliber semi-automatic weapon, a firearm chosen not in panic or rage but deliberately. What followed was swift and controlled, carried out with chilling intention rather than chaos. To prevent anyone outside from realizing what was happening, noise from farm equipment was used to mask the sound of gunfire. One by one, the rest of the Avery family was deceived into coming to the same place. Each was told that someone needed help, each believed they were responding to concern or urgency, and each walked into a situation already decided for them. Within minutes, 5 lives were taken, not as an accident, not as a moment of madness, but as the result of calculated obedience to a man who had fully replaced God with himself. After it was over, there was no immediate hysteria, no frantic escape. Instead, there was a disturbing stillness. The followers began doing what Lundgren had trained them to do: justify, spiritualize, and rationalize. They told themselves this was not murder. They told themselves it was obedience. They told themselves it was necessary to see God. In Lundgren's world, morality had been stripped away and replaced with submission. Murder was no longer a crime, it was a command. And the silence that followed was the sound of a cult finally crossing the line it could never return from. The day after the killings, before anyone even knew a crime had occurred, fate came uninvited to Jeffrey Lundgren's door. On April 18, 1989, officers happened to stop by his Ohio farm on an unrelated matter, a routine visit that should have meant nothing, but to Lundgren, it felt like the walls were closing in. The encounter rattled him deeply. From that moment on, paranoia took over. He became convinced that discovery was inevitable, that God's chosen plan was unraveling, and that staying put meant capture. Almost immediately, he gathered his remaining followers and fled Ohio, dragging the group south into West Virginia in a frantic attempt to stay ahead of consequences that had not yet arrived. 4 months, nothing happened, no arrests, no sirens, and no questions. The silence was unsettling rather than reassuring. The promised divine reward never came, and the world did not end the way Lundgren had predicted. Slowly doubt crept in. The confidence he once projected began to erode, and his authority weakened. Eventually he made a quiet but telling move: he left the group behind. Lundgren took his family and relocated to California, abandoning the followers who had trusted him with their faith, their money, and their lives. Those left behind in West Virginia were now isolated, confused, and exposed, forced to sit with what they had participated in without the man who had justified it for them. 9 months later, on January 3, 1990, the truth finally surfaced. A tip from an informant sent investigators back to the long-abandoned Ohio farm. What they found there confirmed the worst fears and shattered any remaining illusion of secrecy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. 5 members of the Avery family, gone without explanation for months, now revealed to have been deliberately erased. The case exploded into the national spotlight almost overnight. Media descended, questions multiplied, and law enforcement escalated the search. Jeffrey Lundgren and his family were now fugitives. The FBI joined the manhunt, tracking movements, contacts, and anyone connected to the group. One by one, the abandoned followers were located, questioned, and confronted with the reality of what they had helped enable. Under interrogation, the belief system that once felt unshakable began to collapse. The spiritual language faded. The justifications unraveled. Loyalty cracked. Former followers started talking. first cautiously then fully, turning on the man they once called Dad. By early 1990, the cult had completely imploded. 13 members were arrested, including Jeffrey Lundgren and his wife, pulling the entire operation into the open. Even his own family was implicated, erasing any remaining distance between leader and crime. What had once been framed as divine purpose was now reduced to evidence, testimony, and handcuffs. Faith did not survive the interrogation room. When stripped of its rituals and rhetoric, all that remained was betrayal, of trust, of belief, and of 5 innocent lives that never stood a chance once obedience replaced conscience. When Jeffrey Don Lundgren finally faced a courtroom in Ohio, the full weight of his actions was laid bare, and the path from faith to horror was mapped in painstaking detail for the jury. Prosecutors presented charges of aggravated murder and kidnapping, emphasizing that the murders of the Avery family were not a spontaneous act of rage or a tragedy of misplaced faith, but a deliberate, methodical plan carried out under the guise of obedience to God. Survivor testimony and confessions from former followers brought the inner workings of Lundgren's cult to light, describing a world where loyalty was demanded without question, obedience was treated as divine virtue, and doubt was punished, all of which left ordinary people complicit in acts they would never have imagined committing on their own. Experts in cult psychology testified on how Lundgren manipulated fear, devotion, and scripture to erode judgment, showing the jury exactly how faith had been weaponized against his followers and ultimately used to destroy a family. Throughout the trial, Lundgren's courtroom demeanor was chilling in its calmness. He listened to the evidence, watched the witnesses, and occasionally took notes, showing no outward remorse, no visible recognition of the lives lost, as if still convinced he had been executing a divine plan rather than orchestrating murder. For the families of the victims, every moment of his composure was unbearable, a reminder that the man responsible for the deaths of 5 innocent people could still maintain an almost clinical detachment from his crimes. When the verdicts were read, the consequences were absolute. Jeffrey Lundgren was sentenced to death, receiving 5 separate death sentences, one for each life he had taken. But he was not the only one held accountable. His wife, Alice Keeler Lundgren, who had been complicit in the crimes, received 5 life sentences, totaling 150 years to life, for conspiracy, complicity, and kidnapping, while their son, Damon Lundgren, was sentenced to 120 years to life for his role in the events. Ron Luff, the key planner and facilitator alongside Lundgren, received 170 years to life, underscoring the severity of his participation. Daniel Kraft, another follower involved, received 50 years to life, while 5 other cult members, Richard Brand, Greg Winship, Sharon Blunchley, Debbie Olivares, and Susan Luff, served roughly 20 years each, being released in 2010 or early 2011 due to plea agreements that allowed for parole at the earliest possible time, though the Ohio State Parole Board had repeatedly denied earlier requests. Some followers, like Katherine Johnson, Tanya Patrick, and Dennis Patrick, were determined not to have been involved in the murders themselves and received minor sentences for obstruction of justice, with the Patrick sentences suspended entirely. The trial illustrated the stark divide between those who had been fully complicit in Lundgren's deadly plan and those whose faith and loyalty had been manipulated but did not extend to murder. Every sentence reflected not just the law, but the human cost of blind obedience, the ripple effects of cult control, and the long shadows cast over families, communities, and even the followers themselves, many of whom would carry the weight of guilt, trauma, and betrayal for the rest of their lives. Appeals and delays stretched for years, but in the end justice, though delayed, was definitive, reinforcing that while obedience may have been twisted into a weapon, the law could still draw a line that faith could never justify. Jeffrey Don Lundgren spent the final years of his life confined within the quiet, rigid walls of Ohio's death row, a world defined by routine, observation, and the ever-present reality of his sentence. Days were marked by meals, periods of isolation, brief time in the yard, and hours of reflection, each moment emphasizing the slow passage of time and the certainty of what awaited him. Even in confinement, Lundgren maintained his belief in his mission, continuing to see himself as a man chosen by God, while the outside world remembered him only for the lives he had destroyed. He never publicly expressed remorse for the Avery family, and his relationship with religion in prison remained intensely personal, a mixture of private prayer, scripture study, and reflection on his beliefs, detached from the moral and ethical framework that had governed ordinary life. Appeals and legal challenges delayed the execution at times, but they did not change the inevitable. With each passing day, the weight of anticipation and the knowledge of his fate became inescapable, a constant reminder that the consequences of his actions were approaching with absolute certainty. Even in this liminal reflective space, Lundgren's composure remained, but the quiet of death row pressed heavily on him, shaping his final days with isolation, contemplation, and the long, unbroken wait for the sentence that would ultimately claim his life. On October 24, 2006, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Jeffrey Lundgren faced the final chapter of his life. In the hours leading up to his execution, the weight of inevitability settled over him. He was offered a final meal of turkey, potatoes and gravy, a salad and pumpkin pie, chosen by him as a small, personal ritual in the midst of what would be the most consequential day of his life. The routine of eating, familiar yet finite, underscored the gravity of the moment, a brief comfort before the end. As the execution approached, Lundgren spoke his final words, leaving behind a statement that reflected his focus on faith and family, rather than the crimes for which he was being punished. For my last words, I'd like to profess my love for God, my family, my children, and my beloved wife. I am because you are, he said, a mixture of devotion and reflection in his voice. These words were his final attempt to humanize himself, to connect with the people and beliefs that had defined him, even as the law prepared to close his story permanently. The sentence was carried out by lethal injection, ending the life of a man whose actions had left devastation and sorrow in their wake. With no family to claim his remains, Lundgren was interred in the prison cemetery, a solitary end to a life that had been defined by manipulation, faith twisted into violence, and the tragic consequences of absolute obedience. For the victims' families and the wider community, the execution brought legal closure, but it could never erase the pain, the betrayal, or the chilling legacy of the crimes he had orchestrated. Jeffrey Lundgren's story is a chilling reminder of how faith can be twisted, how trust can be exploited, and how one person's obsession can destroy countless lives. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into true crime. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think drives someone to take control of others so completely? And remember, behind every headline, there are real people whose stories demand to be heard.